Welcome, everyone. I am David Vaucher, and this is the Return on Racing podcast, powered by Vaucher Analytics, the company that helps teams and drivers drive efficiencies off track so they can fuel success off it. The show is also brought to you by the Motorsports Sponsorship Accelerator. This is the most cutting edge course out there for sourcing sponsorships more efficiently and driving incredible value for your sponsors. I promised in the introduction episode for this podcast that every episode would be about 10 minutes long, and unfortunately, I think I'm going to break that promise right off the bat. This topic is just so exciting to me, and I am just beyond excited to be able to share the results that I have with you. But before I get ahead of myself, let me just go ahead and set some context. When I'm not sim racing, I'm studying motorsport, often by letting old races play in the background while I work. Lately, I've been digging into archived Indy 500 broadcasts on YouTube, and these are absolutely fantastic for soaking up both the technical and aesthetic DNA of their respective eras. These broadcasts show everything but the old commercials and really make me feel like I'm time traveling. But the 1977 Indy 500 broadcast offered something more than atmosphere. Around the 54-minute mark, after Jackie Stewart gives a characteristically candid take on track safety, this was something that was really important to him, Chris Economaki delivers a short segment listing every piece of safety gear a driver will wear for the race. This is the 1977 Indy 500 again, but he does so with prices. Now, I have an article on the website for Vaucher Analytics, which is just www.vaucheranalytics.com in the Insights section, and this article has the YouTube video actually embedded in the body. But for those of you listening to the podcast, let me just go ahead and play this clip for you so we can all hear from Mr. Economaki himself.
Any number of serious accidents here in Indianapolis, which the drivers walk away from. Why? Because of the tremendous emphasis on safety, ordered by the Speedway and by the sanctioning United States Auto Club. Safety in car construction and safety in what the drivers wear when they're at the wheel. Let's take a look now at the driver's safety equipment. He starts out with his flame retardant underwear. Long johns, they're called. Double thickness nylon material. Hot and uncomfortable. Tops and bottoms. Regardless of how hot the day, they're mandatory. $77 the set. His socks look like any other pair of sweat socks, but they're specially made out of flame retardant nylon. $20 the pair. Then comes the uniform. Double thickness, quilted, hot and uncomfortable, but more importantly, safe. Tailor-made, $281. Then his driving shoes, specially made of flame retardant material, with soles that he can feel the pulse of the throttle under his foot. $94 a pair. Then over his head, another nylon flame retardant hood. The Europeans call it a balaclava. The price, $40. On the bottom of his crash helmet, he fastens a nylon skirt, flame retardant material, which he tucks inside the collar of his driving suit. This to keep any flames from getting in his shirt. The price of this, $36. Then, the most important piece of safety equipment, the crash helmet. Polycarbonate, an expensive piece of equipment and the most important part of a driver's safety gear. The driver's visor, the shield, the cheapest part of the gear at $11, the helmet, $88. And then comes the driving gloves, specially made with treated leather palms so he can get the feel of the wheel, flame retardant nylon backing, lined with wool, and then under the wool, more flame retardant nylon. Expensive at $91 a pair. And to carry all of this material is a special ditty bag, $55. So the total cost of a driver's safety gear, $793. And he needs a second set, too, for when one's in the wash. So to come to Indianapolis, you need almost $1,600 worth of safety equipment. But it's not as expensive as it sounds, because the supplier, Simpson Safety Equipment, pays the freight on all orders over $1,000.
So how incredible is that? We literally know how much this safety equipment cost almost 50 years ago. And this caught my attention immediately. I love picking up data from various sources and trying to make some sense of it. And with so much talk today about the rising costs of competing in top-level racing, I realized this was a golden opportunity, a chance to do a real apples-to-apples comparison between the cost of 1977 and 2025 safety equipment. Even better, and this is where it's almost even more unbelievable, the vendor that was featured in that segment Simpson safety equipment still exists under the name of Simpson Race Products. This meant I could go straight to the source nearly 50 years later and uncover some surprising insights about how costs have shifted, where the pain points really are, and what this says about the evolving economics of racing today. The methodology was relatively straightforward. All the costs in 1977 were, of course, taken from the original TV segment, but I've left out the costs of the bag since it's less relevant to the analysis. I escalated the cost to 2025 levels with an inflation calculator that I have linked in the article on the Vosh Analytics website, and of course, 1977 was taken as the baseline. Where possible, I selected the cheapest price at full MSRP, so no sale prices here, made in the USA option from Simpson, because of course, back in 1977, things would presumably have all been made in the USA. Now, this wasn't always possible for the 2025 items, but to the extent it was, that's what I selected. And this last part is key. The equipment that I selected off of the Simpson website had to be compliant with the latest IndyCar rulebook, the 2025 edition, which is freely available, and I've linked that in the article as well. And the reason for this is pretty straightforward. There's various different kinds of racing, there are various different kinds of standards. We want to make sure that the equipment that is selected today is actually equipment that would be valid for an IndyCar race. And so that was always the benchmark. The headline results are as follows. Overall results show a 40% increase in normalized IndyCar safety equipment costs from 1977 to 2025. Now, this is, of course, for that limited basket of equipment that was mentioned in this segment. I'll get back to that at the end of this podcast episode. And of course, this is overall. Now, I have a summary table in the article. I'm not going to walk you through every single detail of it, but it does show some very interesting trends. But the overall headline to keep in mind is that relative to what costs were in 1977, costs are now 40% more expensive than they should have been under regular inflation. Now, this is an important concept to keep in mind. Before we dive too deeply into the cost analysis, we should remember that in racing, there are three primary types of cost escalation. The first is just nominal or normal inflation. Now, I don't want to get into a tangent about economics, but you want some inflation in the economy to keep investments up. Most Western central banks will aim for about 2% a year, and it's completely normal to have some rise in prices over time. The second component is technical or regulatory inflation, and this is going to be for safety or quality of racing purposes, and it will manifest itself primarily in the making the regulation change itself. So, for example, implementing a new motor, implementing a new hybrid powertrain. Pick your regulation. Implementing a halo is a great one in terms of safety examples. And then there's, of course, also the switching costs to get to that point. So there's the change itself and the work that requires to actually get to the point where you make that change. And then the third component is going to be market inflation, which is relative to supply and demand. So in other words, if a new component is required or people just want to implement a new component or a new piece of equipment, if there are only certain manufacturers that can make it, of course, that gives them some leverage to raise prices, and you'll see that show up in cost inflation as well. So those are the three components: nominal inflation, technical and regulatory, and market driven. So the headline result is that in as close to a 1.1% comparison as possible, safety equipment costs have increased 40%. In other words, over and above nominal inflation, so what the costs today should be, in quotes, costs in 2025 due to regulatory inflation are 40% more expensive than they would be if costs for the same products in 1977 were escalated over time. Well, why is this? The answer is that, straightforwardly, even though I have tried to make this comparison as apples to apples as possible, these are not the same products. Each and every element in the summary table is higher performing and more comfortable than what AJ Foyt was wearing when he won in 1977. However, each and every element in that summary table did not become more expensive in normalized terms. And this is where the results get really, really interesting. Before I go on, let me take a quick break to tell you all about the Return on Racing newsletter. If you want more insights like this, please consider subscribing to the Return on Racing newsletter. This is the weekly newsletter from Vosh Analytics, which covers actionable motorsport strategy, cost breakdowns, and sponsor intel in less than 500 words. The key here is concentrated insights so that you can make the most of them quickly and apply them to your own situation. You can sign up right on the front page of the Voce Analytics website. That's www.voceanalytics.com. Now, let's get back to the analysis. The most immediately critical safety items have, in fact, become more expensive. Now, I know that every safety item is critical, but when I say immediately critical, I'm talking about frontline supplies. What do I mean by that specifically? The final column in the summary table indicates that two items have, in fact, become more expensive in normalized terms from 1977 to 2025: the racing suit and the helmet. The racing suit is a relatively modest 8% more expensive over nominal inflation. Certainly, this is a much higher performing garment than what drivers had in 1977. And it's interesting to note that modern supply chains have probably helped to keep costs down. After all, how much more would today's racing suits cost if they were made in the USA? The clear outlier here is the helmet, whose cost has categorically soared from around $500 in normal costs to $3,000 for an FIA 8860 2018 homologated model. This is an almost 6 times increase. So, just to be clear again, the roughly $100 that were listed by Chris Economaki in 1977, that's 88 for the helmet, $11 for the visor. It's around $100. That should cost around $500 in 2025 if you just escalated the cost normally. However, the helmet that you need to go race today in an IndyCar race is about $3,000, and this is the cheapest one. There are much more expensive helmets than that meet this FIA standard. So we can surmise that this drastic increase is due to several factors. There could be more R&D required for these helmet manufacturers as regulations become more stringent. A cost structure also involves specialized manufacturing and quality control in limited locations for these helmets. So in other words, you can't just set up shop to make this type of specialized equipment. Also, keep in mind that I probably should have been more clear about this up front, but I'm going to be crystal clear about it now. Safety is safety. There really is no compromising on that. And so the cost is just what it is to get drivers into this safer equipment. However, sometimes things don't go as planned. That's unfortunately just the history of motorsports. And we iterate on that, but unfortunately, the accidents happen first before we can learn some of these lessons. And just built into that statement is that there's the potential for higher liability should something go wrong with one of these helmets. And it could be that that potential liability is factored in to the cost structure of a helmet. Also, another factor could be that there's a relatively small market size for this type of equipment, and so they're the ones having to shoulder the burden of all of these higher cost factors. And then finally, there's just the relatively simple fact, and this goes back to what I mentioned when I mentioned market inflation. There's the simple fact that because manufacturers have some leverage for this type of specialized product, again, you can't make them anywhere and they can't be made by everyone. So these manufacturers have the ability to hold firm on pricing. And really, from a driver's point of view, that should be obvious. If you don't have a properly homologated helmet, you just don't get track time. I'm mentioning these just because they're of interest, but these explanations are somewhat academic to a point, because ultimately the cost is the cost. And a helmet now accounts for more than half, so 55% of a driver's basic safety loadout, up from 13% in 1977 in normalized terms. So if you look at the cost of the helmet in the cost basket mentioned by Chris Economaki, and you take a look at that now under 2025 prices, you'll find the helmet is now 55% of the total cost. So keep that in mind. The racing suit, more expensive in normalized terms, the helmet, much more expensive. So you might be asking yourself, if we have a helmet that is now 6 times higher than what it should be based on 1977 costs, how is it that we're only 40% higher in total costs? How is it that the total basket of safety equipment only costs 40% more? Well, it turns out that what the data shows is that more commoditized, yet of course still critical, safety items are significantly cheaper than they were in 1977. The helmet and racing suit are the two, what I'm calling frontline items, protecting drivers in the event of an accident. But they are not the only safety items, of course, contributing to their well-being. Nevertheless, drivers' gloves and racing shoes, among other items in the summary table, are now significantly cheaper than they were in 1977, despite being higher performing and more comfortable. The cost decreases in normalized terms for these items are striking. Minus 29% for undergarments, minus 64% for the balaclava, minus 66% for driving gloves. So, what are some of the key takeaways from the available cost data for IndyCar? The data is fascinating on its own, but I think it becomes even more so if we think about the implications that these results represent. The first implication is that these cost increases are really only the tip of the iceberg for overall cost escalations. Remember, we're 40% higher on this basic basket of safety equipment. This does not cover the costs of, for instance, the Hans devices. It does not cover the implementation of an aero shield. It doesn't cover any of the other safety equipment that just did not exist in 1977. It wasn't even conceived of at the time. And of course, I'm not even talking technical regulations here. So things like hybrid units, for instance. This is just one tiny basket, which is up 40%. And so I would get the impression that if you broaden that out to all of the various avenues where costs have increased, you would get a very, very large percentage escalation. The second implication is that regulatory changes are a potential blind spot for financially precarious racing teams. Now, I know to potentially casual observers, they might think that, well, every team is racing, that means they're doing well. That's just not the case. There's racing teams in IndyCar that are on the bubble, and this is as of relatively recently. And so, what this implies is that because these cost escalations due to regulatory changes are so large, if teams are not prepared for them, the financial impact can really push them over the edge. And so, this is again something that you're just not going to get away from. If you want to race, you have to follow by the technical and safety standards that are imposed on you. And of course, just following safety standards is the right thing to do right by your drivers. You have to basically absorb them. And so the quicker you can understand what the financial impact of those changes is, the quicker you can get a plan together to actually go after them and mitigate them. The third implication is that supply chains have nevertheless helped keep costs down. The truth is that even though some will lament that supply chains have been offshored, drivers and teams have access to much better equipment now at much cheaper costs than they would have otherwise. Some of these prices, if you were somehow able to travel back to 1977 and bring the 2025 prices into 1977 terms, I think you would see drivers just choke in disbelief. So things like offshoring, things like direct to consumer, that has helped keep costs down and in some way make racing more accessible. The fourth implication, and this is somewhat related to this previous one on supply chains, and this is converse, however, tariffs have the potential to be highly destabilizing. I was curious and I went and looked around and I found that you can actually buy helmets that are made in the USA. However, these are not adapted to IndyCar racing, not even close. They tend to be made more for cruising on two wheels. So while the tariff situation continues to fluctuate, they are still a constant threat and they stand to increase prices on cost items which are made abroad and which are already very expensive. Continuing on this idea of where things are made in the USA actually doesn't seem to be a cost impediment for some safety items. And this was a little more surprising to me. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't find a lot of material that satisfied the criteria I needed on the Simpson website that was actually made in the USA. There were made in Italy products, but the made in the USA products I could find really were only limited to the undergarments. And these were down nearly 30%. 30%, that's huge. I would have expected that for an item which was basically apples to apples, it's still underwear. If you escalated a made in the USA version from 1907 to 2025, I would have expected that in normalized terms, it would be more expensive, and it just wasn't. Now, this is just one data point, but what it says to me is that keeping in mind that it is very hard in any case to just move a supply chain from one place to another, there could be opportunities here to make cost-effective racing goods in the USA and still have those be accessible to a large group of consumers. The sixth implication of this cost data is that the chasm between pro equipment and everything else is massive. And this only highlights the financial leap that is required for drivers as they move through the different steps in a feeder series. Let's just take the example of a helmet. The helmet, which costs $500 in 2025 dollars and 77. So this is that $100 helmet that would cost $500 today. Well, that helmet was state of the art in 1977. It would be good for nothing more than decoration at this point. And even though you can find a $500 helmet, they exist. You can check on the Sparker website, for example. I found examples. But these are not homologated for IndyCar. They're homologated for lower level series. So as you make the leap from sort of amateur ranks to pro-am to am, the equipment costs and the requirements just go up. Now, this is not a secret, but I think that seeing what the cost escalations were for just a helmet really drove home how important it is to be prepared for these financial escalations. What this shows also, sort of a corollary to that, is that sponsorship becomes even more crucial. As you move up the ranks, the costs become higher, and it's really important that you're able to source sponsor partners efficiently and really build long lasting relationships with them, because as costs go up, and what this small basket of equipment is showing me is that costs have gone up a lot and they will continue to go up. And so you need those long lasting partnerships to make your racing sustainable for you. The last point is that cost escalations are difficult to avoid, but with the right types of analyses, they can be mitigated. So if someone were to come to me and say, my costs have increased 40%, now I'm talking overall costs here, just to be illustrative. But if they said, my overall costs are up 40%, what would I do? I'd say, well, do you know what is driving that 40%? Because to take it back now to this safety equipment that we're looking at in this particular analysis, 40% hides the fact that really only two items have gone up. It's the racing suit up about 10% and the helmet up about 450%. Everything else has actually seen reductions in normalized pricing. And so what I would immediately do is say your overall costs are up 40%, but really what we need to do is focus on these particular categories. To go after the other ones is not going to make a huge difference, but if we can make an impact on these two cost drivers, you will see an effect on the overall cost escalation. And that comes from really understanding what is driving the increase in costs. So let's now look past the visor and wrap this up. This analysis started with a curious moment from a decades-old broadcast, but it led to something more serious: a clear, data-backed picture of the influence of regulations changes on racing costs. Safety should never, ever be compromised, and we should welcome any new measures that increase safety on track. However, these measures will likely always come at a monetary cost, and in the face of that inevitability, those racing teams that anticipate this cost most effectively will be the ones best positioned to perform well on track. Now, with that, I want to close out this episode of the Return on Racing podcast. I want to thank you for the time that you've spent with me listening to this analysis. If you want to know more, I highly encourage you to check out the website at www.vocheanalytics.com. Go to the Insights section, and I've got a lot more analysis where this came from. And please, if you want to hear more about this and get it delivered straight to your inbox, please sign up for the Return on Racing newsletter, and you can do that directly from the front page of the website. Thank you so much again, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Return on Racing podcast.